I can say that this is the favorite presentation of the day because it has a different twist to it. I'll not steal his thunder, but the core idea that Jarrod is sharing is how does orchestration compare to cartography, right? How do you think about all these security workflows in an organization, structure them, align them? Let's hear it from Jarrod. Welcome.
Thank you. Hey guys. So my name is Jarrod Barto. I lead our data sciences arm with automatic data processing. Been doing this for a couple of years. I actually have my background is actually in engineering. Formerly an engineer in the healthcare space, then came over into the finance space, did incident response for a little while, and now doing the data science piece. So I put this presentation together, and I was kind of thinking about how to actually present this information. I wanted to make it fun, make it really interesting for you guys. So I hope you guys find this interesting. So let's jump right into it. So what exactly did you get yourself into? So if you guys don't mind, do you mind putting your thumbs up? Is it everybody put their thumbs up, and then I want to take a picture. Real high. Thumbs up, real high. So hold on. Gonna get the pano out real quick. Oh man, everybody thumbs up. Come on, thumbs up. Everybody put your thumbs up really high. Yeah, there you go. Cool. So I'm gonna take a pano. All right, so now when anybody asks how my presentation went, I'm gonna say you guys all gave me thumbs up. Cool. So what exactly did you guys get yourself into with Christopher Columbus and data science, right? So with every organization, you kind of walk into this concept that it's not always the same. So some people might say, well, this is how you approach trying to build a data science program, or this is how you approach trying to do a SIM. Every technology is different within every organization. So I look at it as, Christopher Columbus. He chartered across the ocean. He was uncharted territory, and he didn't know what he was getting himself into. So I kind of look at this as this is kind of my talk of what I want to tell you guys about and how we've kind of approached this. Obviously, I'm not going to stand up here and say that this is the way that you need to do it. This is the way that you need to approach trying to build automations, but what I hope to actually, the goal of this presentation is to tell you guys about our experiences and what worked for us. So this is actually a map that was initially identified back in 1490. And so everybody knows back in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed trying to identify East Asia. But nobody really thought that he actually had a map to drive from. So what's interesting about this to me is, everybody thought he just kind of chartered this path and he had nothing to go by. But actually that's not really true at all. So he obviously had a map that he could drive from initially. And I actually picked this up from the Smithsonian mag. Back in I think it was 2014, they found this map. So if you look really closely though, you can actually see Christopher Columbus and the path he took. Just kidding, I put that there. So, all right, so when we get started down this whole path, what exactly is it that Christopher Columbus had? So he obviously had some sort of a map, probably had a compass, but how exactly does that in turn mean for us as security practitioners? So we kind of already have this map, right? So we have a data warehouse, we have this huge lump of information, we're capturing data. So in our case, we capture 18 billion logs per day, which it's a lot of data that we're able to actually churn through. So just in your environment, you may have tons of data warehouses, you may have tons of different data lakes. The other thing that we have to kind of lead us down this path is a compass. So our compass is our data dictionary. So as you guys are starting to actually try and build context around your data, you obviously have to have some idea about how you approach your data. And without this sort of concept of a data dictionary, you're kind of just guessing. And that's not helping anybody if you're guessing, because you have to be able to understand what you're trying to build against. So where exactly does our data come from? Now, if you guys don't know where your data is, you're too far gone, I can't help you. But most of us know where our data actually resides. So be it the actual network appliances, if it's within our custom applications, if we have data that's coming from our different security technologies, we've got tons of data in many different locations. So understanding where this data comes from, we at least can start to have a contextual basis around, okay, this is actually what we know about the actual data. And from here, now let's start to paint a picture of how we're going to actually use the data that we actually know about. So this is in our business, this is what's important to us. Potentially in your business, you may boil this down into other different key factors of metadata. So in our business, we know that IP, domains, hashes, they're really important to us. So the goal of actually starting with this high-level metadata strategy is you don't want to just pick out everything, because I don't really care that one network appliance has a MAC address, or I don't necessarily care that some user or some specific log is presenting me social security number information. I don't want to get that specific, because it's going to make my life very difficult when I try and start to build enrichments and automations against these sort of logs and different data pieces that we have within our environment. So we start very, very high level. And okay, so now that we've actually identified high level metadata strategies for how we want to approach these different contextual pieces of data from our appliances, we can now start to actually break down the actual sources. So now we're starting to build this map, right? So in conversations that I have with my team, we often talk about, we're capturing 18 billion logs per day, but it's a lot of data to start thinking about, and how you start to actually try and use this and use it contextually correctly, and use it so that it's actually worthwhile in our analyst or incident response lifecycle. So let's start to break down the actual metadata pieces to try and help us try and interpret this a little bit easier. So now we can start to paint this picture and start to make it a little bit easier for us when we start to build out these automations. So the goal is we're trying to simplify very complex and very complex ideas, complex technologies, boil it down to make it a little bit easier, so that when we start to build these automations, okay, we're now going to be able to actually start to use this as a map, right? So that this is what I talk about a lot, and this was actually the basis to the presentation, was the cartography. So this is how we start to map out, and we've taken this now from, you started with the actual appliances or where the different logs will actually reside. We then broke it down to where the actual pieces are within the actual metadata that it applies. And now we're starting to build the actual map where we can say, okay, this is every single appliance that has an IP. And we've now broken that out. So what can we do with this, right? So let's say we get one specific log that comes in, and look, we talked about IDSs in the past conversation. So let's say we have an IP. Okay, well, if I have an IP, now I can turn around and I can say, well, at that specific time, over a certain window, how do I apply that IP back to everything else? Okay, well, I know for a fact that I've just mapped out every single one of my other logs and other data sources. Let's see if it matches anything else. All right, so let's go one step further with this, right? So when we started building years ago, the whole concept around automations and trying to pull this together, we stumbled on some different pitfalls. And so my goal is to kind of talk to you about some of the pitfalls, right? So everybody likes to say, we have these very large budgets, tons of real compute. But the problem is, what happens when you start to actually build out additional automations and you keep building? Somebody else gives you a specific use case. They say to you, hey, go pull this information. I want you to build this automation against this specific set of metadata. Well, then all of a sudden you get another use case, and you keep building out use cases. 2 years down the line, you look back and you're like, wow, I just built out all of these automations a year ago. I was doing the exact same thing, except I might have just tacked on 2 additional metacases, or I had tacked on 1 additional metacase here. It seems like a lot of overlap. So this is the concept of what we all go through on a day-to-day basis. Somebody gives you a use case, you just automatically implement it, and you don't really think about the implications of what that means. Excuse me. So how do we then in turn try and flip this around, right? So instead of thinking, okay, I'm just going to keep tacking on use cases, how do we efficiently design our actual automations that we then try and take the opposite approach and we go to the well once, right? So when we go to the CFO and we say, you know what, we want to make a spend and it's going to cost $1 million. And you go and you say, okay, I allocated $1 million. And then you go back and you're like, oh yeah, but I need to tack on $100,000 more. He's like, no, that's not how that's going to work. You can't go back a second time. But ultimately, that's what we do, right? We always go back, we just tack on another use case. And then we go back to the data warehouse, and then we pull more information. And then we say, well, you know what? I also need this piece of information. I'm going to go back and pull this piece of information. So ultimately, this is what we're doing day to day. So this is the concept of trying to have the opposite in which we're creating efficient designs. So business rules engine. So I'm sure a lot of you probably are familiar with what a business rules engine is. If you were to go on, let's say Wikipedia, look up business rules engine, you would probably see something very close to this, but this is my perspective on how I approach a business rules engine. So what you'll see is normally in a business rules engine, they have the engine, the design patterns, the rules. I just tacked on one additional piece to this, which is the actual ingestion side of this, since this applies very much to us and how we approach security as practitioners. So this is important to understand because this is ultimately how we start to think about workflows, designs, playbooks, how we start to break down how we're actually automating the different pieces that we're building within our tool sets. So obviously the rule sets being on the bottom, they need to be able to connect into any single piece of our business workflow. If that be the actual engine itself, if it's the workflows, and even potentially just the standard context of the sources that you need to pull back the raw logs. It may not be existing in the actual metadata itself that you can just pull back the actual metadata. You need to pull back the full log set. So these rules need to have access to that. So as we start to think about data abstraction and how we actually start to build more efficient design, the goal of this is that you want to be able to make sure that if you're going to pull something apart, you're going to make changes in that workflow that you don't affect the upstream or the downstream. So let's say I need to make a change to my rules engine. Okay, well, I'm going to pick up that piece, and because I've already have this concept of data abstraction, that everything is handing off the actual pieces that are necessary all along the workflow, I can just change my actual rules, and it's not going to affect the start to the log sources. It's not going to affect the actual normalization, the ETL side of the house. And ultimately, it's now just going to move through the entire process flow. So how do we actually bring this all together, right? So right now, we've talked about cartography. We've talked about how we actually break this down. We have our context of the different applications. We have the different metadata that it applies to. So now we've actually pulled together an entire actual model. So here, let's say I'm using this use case as categories. So category is kind of the overarching entire engine, if you will. So let's say we have a malware category. So somebody came in, somebody said, I just had an IDS alert that popped, and it's related to malware. Okay, well, I'm going to now associate malware with every single one of in yellow. Firewalls, proxies, I'm going to pull back the emails. So at this point, I'm now going to associate every single one of those. We now have every single one of these tables that now have populated based on us being able to categorize this specific business engine. So now we've taken from the start, we've taken the actual concept, and we've gone all the way over to the left, all the way over to the right. And so this is kind of how we've approached this. in the concept of trying to build this business workflow, but obviously your business may be a little bit different. So this is not to say that you guys won't make some fine tuning and tweaks to this, but this is to kind of start to actually turn the wheels in your head to think, okay, how can I apply actually taking what you know as your high-level metadata strategy and turn this into a much easier approach at trying to take a large set of data, boil it down into something much more easy to use, because ultimately you can get much more complex with this. This is very, very high level. It's not to say that you couldn't take out 10 million other different pieces of metadata and start to build different pieces together. This is just high level. So with that said, I hope that kind of helps you guys to understand how Christopher Columbus, going into uncharted territory, ultimately pulls back to the data science concepts of how we've approached data science and metadata. So appreciate your time.
There's at least one question here, specific. It says, when you say data, do you mean logs or even configuration data? Because like the entire approach, I can imagine, could be totally either different or maybe same. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Sure. So it's a good question. I think when I talk about data, I'm non-discriminatory. So it could theoretically mean configuration data. It could theoretically mean logs. Because to us, when we talk about data as itself, it doesn't necessarily mean we're talking one specific piece of information. If we can turn a raw log into metadata, or we can turn something else into metadata that we can use, let's say network packets. That's a very weird way to convert that into metadata, but ultimately at the end of the day, you're taking it into something that you can now process, normalize, and start to build it into your entire workflow. So that's our concept of data. So it can mean many different things when I say data.
Very cool. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Oh. Yeah, that I think the Slack collaboration one is a generic one. I do have a question, Jarrod. So
Sure.
The link between, you had the automation towards the end of the life cycle of that. The question I had was, how do you guys see the feedback loop from automation back to more data generated, right? Or how are you thinking about it? I know you guys are in early stages of orchestration journey.
Yeah.
But is there thought, because I saw that pipeline where you had sources of data, normalization, and then eventually going into automation. The question is, I would imagine automation will bring and enrich more. Is that a loop, and then you correct? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? So ultimately, there's probably a whole nother set of data abstraction after this. So the goal of this presentation was not to get into the business side of the house and try and talk to that, but I would ultimately look at that the same way that I actually approach data itself and automations around data. So then we can ultimately say, okay, well, if we look at abstracting business process and the way that you're going to actually pipeline a person to be workflowing an entire process, you're now going to have to actually think about, okay, well, what happens if we change this business department? Are we going to have to change everything downstream or upstream? No, you shouldn't have to do that, because if you abstract even the people process and technology, if you're abstracting it correctly, the handoff should be pretty much uniform. That okay, well, if I make a change here, ultimately I'm not going to have any upstream effects or downstream effects.
Very good, very good. Thank you very much, Jarrod.
Sure.
That was a fantastic analogy. Thanks a lot.